Take yourself back to the Elizabethan era of England, around the 16th century, and you will meet the remarkable English polymath, John Dee, with talents spanning astronomy, navigation, mathematics, and cartography. But it is not that which we are here to discuss. Beyond all of the scientific prowess, Dee immersed himself in the mystical realms of alchemy, divination, and hermetic philosophy, blending the rational with the esoteric. As a trusted advisor to Queen Elizabeth I herself, he was instrumental in advancing the sciences and supporting England's daring maritime explorations, supplying vital navigational tools and maps that fueled the growth of the British Empire. And of course, his vast library, one of the largest in England during his time, became a centre for scholarly pursuit and the spread of knowledge. His fascination with the occult led him to attempt communication with angels through scrying, believing these divine interactions could unlock deeper wisdom and propel his intellectual quests. And so it is this unique combination of scientific dedication alongside mystical exploration that makes John Dee a standout figure in the Elizabethan era. It perfectly captures the era's relentless pursuit of knowledge, but also the harmonious blend of new scientific ideas walking hand in hand with ancient mystical tradition. Hell yeah, cool introduction. Well, we're all going to talk about John Dee today. Not often talked about, but, well, one of the Queen's very important men in her court. I'm going to discuss his life, his beliefs, and a few of the things that he did. And maybe by the end of it, you'll be left with a bit of a mystery. So let's all get nice and relaxed now. Oh, and do the whole like and subscribe thing if you want to. Now, let's begin. So we begin, of course, in London's Tower Ward, where a Welshman named Roland Dee, serving at the Tudor court, had a son with Joanna Wilde, and this son was, of course, John Dee. Now, the family's surname, Dee, it's actually not an English name. It's actually an anglicized rendering of a Welsh word meaning black. Dee could actually trace his heritage deep into Welsh history. His father, well, his grandfather rather, Bedo Du, resided in Nant y Gros, near Pileth in Radnorshire, and the family lore held their lineage stretched back to Rhodri the Great, the 9th century ruler of Gwynedd. Now, it is not proven that would actually stretch back to such a formidable figure, but that was what the family was sticking to. So the Dees had settled in London around the time that Henry Tudor rose to prominence as Crown Prince Henry VII. This intertwines their story with this dawn of the Tudor era. Roland Dee's role as a gentleman courtier and mercer to Henry VIII provided his son John with early exposure to the workings of the royal court, and of course the shifting intellectual currents of the age. Now, this is also a very interesting time with Henry VIII, because it's when England starts to move away from being told what to do all the time by the Pope in Rome. It's when they found the Church of England, because Henry wanted to divorce his wives and the Pope wouldn't let him. Well, maybe you should watch the Henry VIII video for more context on that, but I don't really have the time to explain it now. But it is certainly a different time. Lots of new ideas are coming in, especially in the realms of spirituality, and we'll get to them. So, between 1535 and 1542, Dee received his early education in what is now King Edward VI Grammar School, formerly known as the Chelmsford Chantry School. and by November 1542, when he was roughly 15 years old, he began his studies at St. John's College, Cambridgeshire, and he managed to earn a Bachelor of Arts 3 years later, in 1545. His talents soon garnered an invitation to become one of the inaugural Fellows at Trinity College, Cambridge, which, by the way, was actually founded by Henry VIII himself in 1546. It was during the production of Aristophanes' piece at Trinity that Dee's skill in creating spectacular stage effects led to him being regarded as a magician, though it's important to use that word quite lightly. In the context of the day, this referred more to ingenuity and technical mastery than anything really supernatural. If we want to put it into a sense that might be a little bit more familiar to you, those who have seen Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, know that Gandalf shows up, and all of the kids are wanting him to do the fireworks and everything. Well, he's known as a wizard because he has all the fireworks. Now, there's always that little bit of doubt whether he's doing something actually supernatural, like there is with any good magician or sorcerer, whatever we want to call it. But this is kind of where that tradition comes from, that tradition of using the word magician in a more practical sense of technical mastery that rubbed off a little bit into Tolkien's writings. Anyway, I digress. Forgive me for going on a short Lord of the Rings rant. I'm sure you will. Now, Dee's quest for knowledge, and it was a quest, took him across Europe from the late 1540s into the early 1550s. He lectured on Euclid in Paris, attended scholarly centers in Brussels and Louvain, and studied with the renowned mathematician Gemma Frisius. His friendships with celebrated cartographers, that being map makers, that is the word for making maps, cartography, Abraham Ortelius and Gerardus Mercator, reflected his growing network of European intellectuals. I'm sure you recognize the name Mercator. He also collaborated with the other leading thinkers of the time, including Italy's Federico Comandino, further honing his understanding of mathematics and the sciences. And upon his return to England, he came back with quite a few goodies, certainly bringing back those quest items, a considerable collection of mathematical and astronomical instruments, symbolizing his dedication to this precision, discovery, and innovation. And I'm sure when he was showing all the English that, well, everybody getting quite excited. Well, in 1552, Dee had met the polymath Girolamo Cardano in London, and together they examined a gem that was rumored to have magical properties. Of course, upon discussing this, they touched upon the feasibility of a perpetual motion machine, the kind of things that we would see in the old sketches of Leonardo da Vinci, that kind of thing. Of course, this is, well, going a little bit past the laws of physics, the laws of motion and all the rest. Of course, it wasn't as well understood as it could have been at the time, depending on where you were in the world. But that's where the mysticism comes into play. Either way, in 1554, Dee had turned down an offer from Oxford University to go there and become a mathematics lecturer. He took issue with the university's conservative curriculum, which emphasized the trivium, that being logic, rhetoric, and grammar, over the more advanced quadrivium, being astronomy, geometry, music, and arithmetic. He thought that the whole thing was just too old-fashioned. I suppose he was too cool for school, one could say. He considered essential this quadrivium for true progress in science and philosophy. And either way, by that point, he had held the rectorship of Upton-upon-Severn since 1553, a position that afforded him time to write and to seek greater influence in the legal and scholarly spheres of England. By the next year, 1555, he cemented his status in London's civic and economic life by joining the Worshipful Company of Mercers through patrimony, following in his father's footsteps and reinforcing the family's long-standing connection to the Tudor court, but also the English mercantile elite. Good friends to have around when you're trying to make some coin. Now, we're still firmly in 1555, and in that year, John Dee found himself kind of ensnared in a pretty serious political and religious scandal, which was the style at the time. He was arrested on charges of calculating, because he had cast horoscopes concerning both Queen Mary and Princess Elizabeth. In the fervid atmosphere of suspicion surrounding Mary's reign, these accusations escalated to the severity of treason. Uh-oh. And you know what happens to traitors? Just ask Mary. Well, although Dee managed to clear himself, he was nonetheless handed over to one Edmund Bonner, the Catholic Bishop of London, for more serious religious examination. Given Dee's lifelong penchant for secrecy and his involvement with arcane knowledge, this interrogation could have posed grave danger, not just to his personal safety, but to his reputation too, and that could harm his family. It was one of the most alarming episodes in a life punctuated by harassment and slander. I mean, being handed over to the Catholic Bishop of London for questioning. Well, you know how they did the questioning. I'm sure you've watched my Inquisition video and all that. We don't want to think too much about that. Poor old John. But remarkably, John had quite a way with words, and after navigating these treacherous waters of his life, he proved his innocence, and he even managed to form a close friendship with Bishop Bonner, which, well, I suppose they're the original old couple, I guess. Well, the next year, 1556, fingers crossed for a brighter turn of events, Dee presented to Queen Mary an ambitious proposal that aimed to safeguard England's cultural heritage by preserving ancient books, manuscripts, and historical records. I like him already. He further envisioned the establishment of a national library, an unprecedented and forward-thinking concept at the time. Well, unfortunately, the Crown was not as forward-thinking. But though they did not adopt his idea, Dee thought he'd take matters into his own hands. So he started actively acquiring as many manuscripts and texts as he could, and not just from England, from all over the European continent, somewhat obsessively collecting them, like a Pokemon card collector or something like that. Well, over time, his personal collection at his home in Mortlake would become England's greatest private library. And of course, that attracts the tourists from near and far. And right in the middle of it is John Dee, at the center of the intellectual milieu outside the traditional academic strongholds of Oxford and Cambridge, still clinging to their medieval trinity. It was time for a new, hands-on approach to learning, and John Dee was carrying the standard. And so, Dee's fortunes took a new turn when Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558. He became one of her close advisers in matters of astrology and natural philosophy, tasks that he continued until her death in 1603. He's credited not only with choosing the auspicious day for her coronation, but also aligning himself to Protestantism, in keeping with the religious shift of the new regime, which you really wanted to keep with. So from the 1550s through the 70s, Dee offered guidance on maritime exploration, providing navigational and strategic counsel that helped England establish itself as a seafaring power. It was Dee who first coined the phrase British Empire, foreshadowing the nation's future global reach, though he never really lived to see it. But in October 1574, seeking patronage and influence, Dee wrote to William Cecil, Lord Burghley, invoking these alleged occult insights. In fact, he claimed to know of hidden treasures in the Welsh marshes and valuable manuscripts that were locked away in the depths of Wigmore Castle, a subtle appeal to Burghley's ancestral connections and a calculated attempt to gain the powerful minister's support. After all, who would give up buried treasure? Well, among Dee's most enigmatic contributions to the esoteric intellectual world was his own publication in 1564, the Monas Hieroglyphica, or Hieroglyphic Monad. This deeply hermetic and Kabbalistic work offered an intricate symbolic synthesis meant to express the mystical unity that underlies all creation. Dee hoped to impress the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian II, by dedicating this treatise to him and attempting to present it to him around the time the emperor was taking the throne of Hungary. If that doesn't impress the emperor, I don't know what will. Either way, John Dee wanted that imperial favor. Also, he authored a treatise on cryptography that earned high praise from the Royal Secret Service and several learned contemporaries. Yet modern scholars seem to struggle to decipher its full meaning, as the key to its interpretation likely laid in oral tradition and secret teachings, and unfortunately, they've long since faded from our memory. He also made the case that mathematics should be regarded as important due to its impact on other areas of creativity and scientific investigation in the mathematical preface he wrote in 1570 for Henry Billingsley's English translation of Euclid's Elements. Despite being written for an audience not associated with universities, it became Dee's most widely influential and often reprinted work. Dee pushed for a strategy that would fortify England's political and economic standing and start the process of establishing colonies in the New World, starting in 1570. His work, Britannicae Republicae Synopsis in 1570, covered topics such as trade, morality, and national authority, in addition to giving a summary of the Elizabethan realm's current situation. His general and rare memorials pertaining to the perfect art of navigation, published in 1576, was the first book in a series aimed at promoting the founding of English colonies overseas. Unfortunately, though, it was never finished. In a frontispiece intended to be symbolic or otherwise significant, Dee featured a figure of Britannia kneeling by the shore and begging Queen Elizabeth to defend her country by bolstering the navy. Dee used Geoffrey's inclusion of Ireland in King Arthur's conquests to bolster his argument that King Arthur had created a British empire outside of the United Kingdom. He also maintained that England would profit economically from the founding of new colonies, which would be safeguarded by a strong navy. But this term British Empire has also been recognized as coined by Humphrey Lloyd, somewhere in 1568. He is credited with the term's initial use, but Dee is credited with its unofficial creation. It's a bit complicated. Either way, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that by the late 1570s, John Dee had moved beyond this scholarly speculation and informal assertions, opting instead to formally advance England's claims on the New World. On the back of a map, produced sometime between 1577 and 1580, he penned a clear legalistic case for English sovereignty in North America. In his 1580 Title Royal, Dee argued that prior explorers tied to English heritage had reached the Americas long before the Spaniards did. Specifically, he claimed that the medieval Welsh prince Madog ab Owain Gwynedd had set foot in the New World, and that two late 15th century navigators, Robert Thorne's father and a certain Mr. Eliot of Bristol, had discovered Newfoundland around 1494. Certainly bold claims. Hard to prove right, but equally as hard to prove wrong. Maybe that was the strategy. To bolster England's position, Dee drew on semi-legendary figures such as Brutus of Britain and King Arthur, as well as the historical Madog. He contended that Elizabeth I's empire had a legitimate ancestral claim to the North American lands, traced through a lineage of British adventurers and conquerors who had supposedly taken possession of territories there. Dee had articulated these imperial visions as early as 1577, with his publication of the general and rare memorials pertaining to the perfect art of navigation, work that set forth his blueprint for that expansive English maritime force. He thus linked the intellectual heritage with geopolitical ambition, cultivating connections with prominent court figures such as Humphrey Gilbert, and maintaining a close rapport with Sir Philip Sidney and members of his influential circle. Yet, by the early 1580s, Dee found himself increasingly frustrated. His quest to unravel the secrets of the natural world felt like it was progressing too slowly, like a stagnant pool. His once celebrated counsel at court had diminished to near irrelevance. Plans he had supported, ranging from a reformed calendar system to a more systematic colonial enterprise, had either stagnated or failed to gain traction. He was losing on all fronts. Well, what goes up must come down, I suppose. The mixed and often disappointing results of the English expedition to North America left his dreams of British maritime empirical supremacy largely unrealized, at least in the way that he had envisioned. And thus he was disillusioned with the earthly avenues of advancement. These ambitions turned inward and upward, toward the spiritual, toward the supernatural. Convinced that divine intermediaries might offer knowledge and influence denied to him in the mortal sphere, he began experimenting with techniques to contact angels. With the help of a scryer, someone he believed capable of seeing and conversing with spirits, Dee embarked on what would become a defining phase of his life. In seeking direct communication with angels that he thought to exist, he hoped to acquire the transcendent insight and authority that had eluded him in the courts of these earthly sovereigns. After several unsuccessful attempts with various scryers, Dee eventually made contact with Edward Kelly, then known as Edward Talbot, in 1582. Kelly made quite the impression on Dee with his skills, and they became quite good friends. After being brought into Dee's employ, Kelly immediately threw himself into pursuing his supernatural beliefs. These spiritual conferences or actions were always conducted with a great deal of fervor and devotion to the Christian faith, following periods of fasting, prayer, and purification. There was no question in Dee's mind that they could benefit humanity. After all, he's contacting angels, right? Evaluating Kelly's character is a little more challenging. Some people tend to think he acted cynically. It is impossible to rule out the possibility that he engaged in delusion or self-deception too. Maybe he was just going along with the whole thing for the coin. That's always a possibility. The volume, complexity, and vividness, however, of Kelly's subject matter make the output quite noteworthy. According to Dee's journals, angels used methods to speak to him, dictating multiple books via Kelly. A few of these books were composed in a distinctive Enochian or angelic language. And so, in 1583, Dee had the opportunity to meet Albert Lasky, a poor but popular Polish politician. He was so well received at court that he invited Dee to travel with him back to Poland. Apart from the fact that his legal circumstances were getting worse, Dee decided to do so after being persuaded to do so by the angels through Kelly once more. When Lasky, Kelly, and their families left in September of 1583, it was found that Lasky had lost favor in his own nation and become financially insolvent. He failed to mention that when they were planning the holiday. No wonder he made them pay for the tickets. Maybe. Well, spiritual conferences that Dee described in his diaries and the almanacs that he had collected continued when he and Kelly began their nomadic life in Central Europe. Kelly kept going to these conferences as well. When they met with Emperor Rudolf II of Prague and Stefan Bathory of Poland, they were able to persuade both of them of the importance of angelic communication. Located near Krakow, the Polish capital at the time, Neopolmic Castle, I'm sorry for the Polish pronunciation, served as the venue for the Bathory meeting. But unfortunately, not everybody was ready to give him a warm welcome. Despite his reputation as a man of great knowledge, he was also distrusted because of his association with England's Queen. Some thought that he was a spy sent by Elizabeth herself. And Dee did write a secret letter to the spymaster Francis Walsingham saying, "I am forced to be brief. That which England suspected was also here." At the start of their meeting or meetings, the Polish king, a pious Catholic who was suspicious of supernatural intermediaries, said that prophetic revelations had to be consistent with the teachings of Christ, the mission of the Holy Catholic Church, and the Pope's approval. And at that time, getting the Pope's approval for anything as an Englishman, that was kind of difficult. At a religious assembly held in Bohemia in 1587, Kelly told Dee that the angel Uriel had commanded the men to divide everything they owned, including their wives. I wonder what the wives thought about that. Particularly among the Central European royal families, it was a profession with a potential for significant and sustained financial gain. As a result, by this time Kelly had become somewhat of an alchemist, and was therefore more in demand than Dee. Dee, however, was more interested in speaking with angels, and that doesn't make as much money as alchemy. But he did think that they would help him use science, navigation, astrology, mathematics, and optics to solve the mysteries of the heavens. It might have been that Kelly wanted to stop Dee from depending on him as a diviner, and at their increasingly long and frequent spiritual meetings he was just getting tired of the whole thing. Dee suffered because of the order to share wives, but it seems that he did not doubt the legitimacy of the order, and it seems that they did indeed do that. On the other hand, these spiritual conferences, seances, if you will, seem to have stopped around this time, and he returned to England in 1589. Kelly got himself a nice little job as an alchemist for Emperor Rudolf II. Not a bad gig. Dee's wife gave birth to a son on February 28, 1588, whom he baptized Theodorus Trebonianus Dee, and reared as his own. We don't really know whether it was his actual son because of this whole wife-sharing thing, but Well, you are not the father. Either way, the son was raised as Dee's own, so I'm gonna step up for this kid. So after 6 years away from Mortlake, Dee returned to find his home had actually been vandalized. His library was completely destroyed, and most of his valuable books and instruments were stolen. In addition, he found that the increasing disapproval of occult practices had made England even less receptive to his new ideas. Elizabeth, who had hoped that he would be able to persuade Kelly to return and use alchemy to ease England's economic burdens, offered him support. She ultimately decided to name Dee Warden of Christ's College in Manchester in 1595. Well, this institution, formerly known as the College of Priests, was re-established as a Protestant institution in 1578 by royal charter. However, his fellow travellers either hated him or betrayed him, making it difficult for him to control them. He was considered at the start of his tenure for the demonic possession of 7 children, but he showed very little interest in the case, even though he permitted those involved to consult his still large library to figure out what to do about the situation. Even after Dee returned to London from Manchester in 1605, he remained warden until his death. By that time, Elizabeth had passed away, and James I did not want to help him. Until his death in Mortlake in the late half of 1608, or perhaps the early part of 1609, at the age of 81, he was cared for by his daughter, Catherine. In order to support himself and his daughter, Dee had to sell off a number of belongings during his last years of poverty. Both the gravestone that belongs to Dee and the parish registers are still missing. But in 2013, there was a memorial plaque placed on the south wall of the present church in Dee's honor. So that's something. But you see, the story does not end with the magician's death. About 10 years after Dee's death, antiquarian Robert Cotton bought the land around the home and started hunting for papers and artifacts on location. He found several manuscripts, most of them chronicles of communications from Dee's angels. This divine insight, pen to paper. Cotton's son gave these manuscripts to the scholar Merrick Casaubon, who published them in 1659. The book was titled A True and Faithful Relation of What Passed for Many Years Between Dr. John Dee and Some Spirits. Could have picked a better title, but okay. Either way, it was the first public disclosure of Dee's spiritual conferences, and you can imagine that that was extremely popular. As conservative as everybody was, and as, well, people wanting to dodge the Inquisition and all the rest, it was still just too cool not to buy. Well, he also included a lengthy introduction that was critical of the work's author. Of course, he had to, didn't want to run afoul of the authorities. According to Casaubon, who believed in the existence of spirits, Dee was unknowingly serving as the instrument of evil spirits when he thought he was actually speaking with angels. In the introduction, he made the case that Dee was behaving in this way throughout the whole work. This book was principally responsible for the belief that Dee was a liar and a deluded fanatic, a belief that endured over the next 2.5 centuries. Perhaps some people still think that way. Well, members of the Rosicrucian movement, of which Dee was actually a member, asserted that he was among them at the time of the publication of the True and Faithful Relation. However, there is some doubt as to whether a Rosicrucian movement existed during Dee's lifetime at all, and there's no proof that he ever belonged to any sort of covert fraternity. He has become a figure that seems to be irresistible to modern magicians, though. horror story writers and fabulists, due to his reputation as a magician and the compelling tale of his association with Edward Kelly. Even though the facts of Dee's life were remarkable, there is also that tendency for the accumulation of fanciful information. And there's enough good stuff, I think, that we don't need to make things up. Furthermore, it does nothing to advance his Christian beliefs. You see, Dee sought guidance from angels on how to mend the severed and profound divisions that existed between the Protestant movement in England, the Reformed Church of England, and the Roman Catholic Church. He served as Queen Elizabeth's court astronomer on several occasions. This was not only because he was a Hermetic arts expert, but also because he was a man of great faith, wisdom, and integrity, and you must take that into account. Elizabeth wasn't going to let any old runabout just into the court to start using all of the things and all that sort of thing. It just would not have happened, and she certainly would not have let a heretic into the court. This isn't some kind of devil worship situation. No. If anything, we can look at it as a step above prayer, direct contact. Instead of wanting to speak to God, he wanted to speak with God. Maybe we can look at it in that way. At least, that's how I see it. But of course, the 20th century sees this re-examination of Dee's character and his importance, largely due to the work of historians Dame Frances Yates and Charlotte Fell Smith. Now, both of them help to highlight that parallel, the roles that science, religion, and magic played during the Elizabethan Renaissance. After all, they don't call it a Renaissance for no reason. Renaissance being rebirth, okay? Both of these authors effectively say that, well, that Dee has been effectively slandered, even misjudged, by pretty much everyone who came across him in his time. As a result of this and later re-evaluation, Dee's now considered more of a serious scholar and book collector, a devout Christian, albeit at a confusing time for that faith, an accomplished scientist, and all over, one of the most learned men of his time. His Mortlake library was the biggest in England until it was vandalized. Ugh. You can imagine what kind of monstrous people could do that to such a place. It's terrible. Of course, it was regarded as the best in Europe, too, perhaps second only to Defoe's, which was made a great personal defense, sometimes to the point of ruin. Along with being an early advocate of colonizing North America, he also provided Elizabeth and her court all of the scientific and astrological advice they needed. It was the foundation on which British colonialism was sitting upon. Well, Dee promoted the development of the disciplines of navigation and cartography. He was a close pupil of Mercator and possessed a substantial collection of maps, globes, and astronomical instruments. He pioneered that development of specialized navigational techniques and created new instruments for use in polar regions, the final frontier, and it would remain the final frontier until the early 20th century. Dee personally chose pilots and provided them with navigational training while serving as an advisor to the English exploration expeditions. Additionally, he facilitated the expeditions himself, believing that the crucial component of human education was mathematics, which he interpreted in a more mystical way. Dee is a more modern Francis Bacon in that regard, because mathematics played such a role in his vision. Of course, he was also familiar with the work of Copernicus, which was his ward and assistant Thomas Digges had translated into English. Christopher Bra was also friends with Dee, yet many of his astronomical calculations were based on Copernican assumptions. Even though he never openly supported the heliocentric theory, and we say openly because, and we all know what happened to Galileo. Therefore, Dee applied the Copernican theory to the calendar reform issue. He was called upon in 1583 to advise the Queen on the new Gregorian calendar, which Pope Gregory XIII had instituted starting in October of 1582. His recommendation was that England accept it, but not without a few specific changes. It was first proposed that the calendar be adjusted by 11 days, which would return it to the time of Christ's birth, rather than 10 days, which would return it to the period of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Council of Nicaea being the council in which they decided on some matters of doctrine, particularly with Arianism. I've made a video on that too if you want to go watch it. Whatever. Well, one of Dee's other recommendations was to align the liturgical and civil years, starting both on January the 1st. England may have decided to reject proposals that came from the papacy, even though they might have had some significance. But of course, really, from the perspective of the 21st century, these acts fall somewhere between contemporary science and just plain magic. But you can't really draw a clear line, can't you? Especially back in those days. He was given the chance to lecture on Euclidean geometry at the University of Paris, despite the fact he was only in his early 20s at the time. He was a leading authority on navigation, a passionate supporter of mathematics, and highly esteemed in the field of astronomy. But it was sorcery that he really threw himself into. Hermetic philosophy. He made a tremendous effort to speak with those beyond during the last 30 years of his life. He sought to establish a pre-apocalyptic human unity and learn the universal language of creation. This quest for a transcendent comprehension of divine forms that exist beneath the maternal world was what he called pure verities, verity being the word for truth, the highest truth. He was of course influenced by Marsilio Ficino's Neoplatonism of the Renaissance, and did not distinguish between his studies of divination, hermetic magic, and angel summoning, and his mathematical research. Well, we get to the end of it now. Didn't that really go down a bit of a rabbit hole, Mr. John Dee? Not many people talk about him anymore, so it's probably best that I lead by example and talk about him. Anyway, speaking of leading by example, those great and lovely people who support the channel, well, everybody supports the channel by watching it, of course, but some choose to go above and beyond. And they are Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, check him out on YouTube, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, and Wendy, with a capital W. Good night, everyone. May you have a good dream. And I will see you in the next video. Lots of love to you all. Kiss, kiss. Good night.